Thank you for the nice welcome. My name is Paul. It's great to be here on a Sunday afternoon, almost a Sunday evening. I'd like to talk about forest landscape restoration. I'm going to talk a bit from the experience of International Tree Foundation, which is where I work, and that experience goes back almost 100 years. But I'll also draw on my personal experience as a tree planter, which happily doesn't go back quite so far, only goes back to the 1970s, and some of the lessons I've learned along the way. Now, we may think of forest landscape restoration as, in some senses, quite a new, relatively new idea, perhaps driven by our new understanding of climate change and the drivers of climate change, our understanding that tree planting and forest landscape restoration is one of the obvious and well-evidenced ways of tackling global climate change. And also, that we are addressing at the same time the huge problem of land degradation, which runs at something like a quarter of the land area of the planet. And so the urgency of these drivers lead us to set some great commitments, and the Global Landscape Forum is a wonderful place to hear these commitments, to plant 1 million trees, 10 million, national commitments, 20 million, 30, 40, 50, 100 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion. 1 trillion trees. We're up to 1 trillion in our commitments. And we're all involved in this. I, at International Tree Foundation, I sort of wake up thinking about the 20 million trees that we're going to plant in and around the Kenyan water tower forests, or the 15 million trees that we're going to plant in around the Mount Bamboutos massif in Cameroon. And they kind of weigh on me, these great targets. My job description says I'm to be responsible for 10 million trees by 2022, and it sometimes worries me, how are we going to do this? These commitments are great, and they will drive real progress. I just would like to make a tiny warning, perhaps, that we need to avoid becoming, as it were, rushed by these commitments into being top-down. We must not repeat some old mistakes that were clearly made. I'm sure we're not going to plaster distant landscapes with exotic monocultures. That is a mistake we've made in the past. It's probably one that even I've made. So let's learn and not do that again. We can seem top-down here in such conferences, with commitments made by governments at national level, by the big agencies, and by companies. Let's just avoid that. I'd like to draw a little bit on some of our own history as International Tree Foundation. The picture here was taken on a day in July 1922 in Muguga, near Nairobi in Kenya. And the picture there is of the dance of the trees. It was the founding moment of a group called Watu wa Miti, tree people of the trees. And this came about through our founder, Richard St Barbe Baker, who was an extraordinary visionary person who saw even then, in the 1920s, that forests were being lost, that land was being degraded, and had an intuitive understanding of the importance of forest cover as far back as then, long before people talked of carbon sequestration or ecosystem services or all these new ideas that we've invented. He understood this. But he did something even more remarkable. He was a colonial forester serving the British colonial government, and yet he did something that cut right across the assumptions of his time. He reached out to the local community. And that's where I'm going with this discussion of a piece of history. He reached out, he formed a partnership with a chief, Josiah Njonjo, leader of the Kikuyu community, and they called together the warriors of the community for this wonderful dance of the trees, following which the people made an oath to plant trees and conserve forests. And that movement, Watu, Miti, became the Society of the Men of the Trees, responsible for the planting of billions of trees across the world during the 20th century. It's an extraordinary story, and that became, in the 1990s, International Tree Foundation. So we remember those two great principles, really, about the importance of forests, but the absolute importance of communities, the people who live in the landscapes and the community groups, whether from the Sahel, this is a group in Senegal, these folks in Cameroon, or in an area where I've spent a lot of my own life, in Kenya. And just like to speak about the importance of people in the landscapes. People have been planting trees for a very long time, long before we knew about climate change. And people have been planting trees for lots of very, very good reasons. For fruits, for nuts, for fodder for their animals, for fuel, for timber, for soil fertility, soil conservation, soil organic matter, climate modification through windbreaks and shade, humidity, rainfall, water catchment. I'm forgetting a lot of them. Pollination, biodiversity, beekeeping. And this community here in Kenya, on the southeast slopes of Mount Kenya, they are agroforestry people. And, I can see Dennis Garrity here, who could teach us all about agroforestry, but you cannot do agroforestry is a remarkable driver within forest landscape restoration. We cannot do it without the farmers who invent these agroforestry systems, who integrate trees into their farms. I would like to talk a tiny bit about these folks. The lady wearing the white T-shirt, Esther Waweru, I first met in 2015 on the slopes of Mount Kenya in a huge degraded area that we are now restoring. And I wanted to understand the history of that area, and I was very lucky to meet Esther on that day. She was up there, and she was not restoring the forest, she was actually collecting fodder for her cow. But we got to talk with her, and we discovered a truly wonderful person. She had known the area since she was a child, and she had worked with every organization that had tried to restore the area. She knew the names of all of the trees. Her mother was a herbalist. She knew their value. She knew the local names. She knew the scientific names. People like this are extraordinary, and they can drive change. And I'm very glad to say she now works, not with us directly, but with our partners. Mount Kenya Environmental Conservation started out as a youth group on the slopes of Mount Kenya, and today they are supporting more than 20 women groups and self-help groups who raise about 200,000 seedlings every year. They provide seedlings for forest restoration on the slopes of the mountain, and for their own agroforestry, and for the schools where the children learn about tree planting. So my takeaway message is to remember the value of community groups, community-based organizations within these landscapes, who are the people who can do the real work. And we need to cherish these people, we need to support them, we need to give them capacity building, and not assume that we are the ones who are going to achieve these wonderful targets. It is they in their landscapes looking after their own land. And I'll just leave you with a picture of Richard St Barbe Baker, our founder, with a quotation that I hope is still inspirational for us. Thank you very much.